Today, it's my pleasure to be introducing Dr. Erin K. Stapleton. Erin is lecturer in communication and media at the University of Canberra. Their research investigates relationships between queer experience, identity, digital culture, and colonialism. Their work in art, film, gender, queer theory, and philosophy has been published in academic journals, including Third Text and Rhizomes, and in edited collections, including Acephale and Autobiographical Philosophy, Genre Trajectories, Teaching Gender, and True Detection. Their first book, The Intoxication of Destruction in Theory, Culture and Media, A Philosophy of Expenditure after George Bataille, was published by Amsterdam University Press in 2022, and there's a copy here in our library if you'd like to have a read as well. So please join me in welcoming Erin.
Thank you, and I'd also like to acknowledge the owners of the land that we're meeting on today, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, and acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded. Okay, today I'm talking about the response to COVID restrictions in Melbourne, particularly in 2021. So was anyone apart from me living in Melbourne at the time of the COVID restrictions? Hands up, no. Okay, interesting. It was, yeah, sure. It was a kind of an interesting time in many ways because our entire lives were modulated around restriction. And while the rest of the country had various kind of lockdowns and all the rest of it, as I'm sure everyone is aware of from reading the news, Melbourne had some of the longest and most sort of draconian lockdowns in the world. They were really intense in terms of the way that movement was modulated and restricted, the way that curfews in particular were enforced. And while a lot of the restrictions were entirely, within reason, there were some things that were really concerning and problematic, particularly for already sort of disadvantaged people. So things like the life-ruining fines that people were receiving for relatively minor sort of rule violations, things like going just beyond your 5K radius could land you with, thousands of dollars in fines. Also breaching curfew sometimes could end you with like tens of thousands of dollars worth of fines. Curfew in particular was enforced with both drones and police helicopters that would come across our houses every night. So it was a really intense kind of time to live through. So as I said, while some, if not most of the restrictions were completely understandable and reasonable, a lot of those sorts of responses and measures were then responded to in a way that was entirely contingent on people's feeling of what their sense of community, and in opposition to that, what their sense of personal entitlement was to freedom of movement and choice, individual freedom and choice within society. So while there were protests everywhere, there were particularly protests in Melbourne. And again, as everyone I'm sure remembers, there were riots in Melbourne that happened repeatedly over a period of time, particularly in 2021. And they were started as sort of based in a response to restrictions placed upon the construction industry, and were based around like John Setka's leading of the construction union, but it's quickly spiraled well beyond that. John Setka, I'm sure everybody knows, is a really problematic figure. But he was sort of became a more minor figure in the course of the riots, and it really was well beyond the union's control. So a lot of the protests that turned into riots were separate from the union movement, and as you'll see, the people most likely to protest were not simply union members, because union membership looks very different to the people we see on the screen behind us, largely speaking. There was a lot of cosplaying, however, of the use of union, I guess, costuming. So this idea of dressing as working class, of wearing particularly the uniforms of construction workers in the course of the protests. And that sort of indicates more a sense of what we consider to be masculine and masculinity in Australian culture. So this is sort of an enraged kind of resistance to the prospect of responsibility to community and to social obligation that overwhelming numbers of white people and particularly white men feel, which crystallized through the COVID pandemic. So the sort of far right movements that we're seeing now, and particularly the white supremacist movements that we're seeing now, kind of crystallized. They were certainly obviously around beforehand, but they certainly crystallized during this time, and particularly in Melbourne. So these riots were in response to the measures implemented by the government that I described that were designed to curb the spread of COVID. The people involved in these protests were observed to be overwhelmingly white and male, and the series of riots were characterised by frequent instances of unprovoked violence, primarily against bystanders rather than against cops. There was some violence against cops, but mostly bystanders, as well as their animals, which was particularly sort of horrific turn of events. There was a number of protesters that attacked people with their animals in the street, in the city, in the CBD. And then secondarily against police. So in order to understand the riots, which as you'll see in the images I'm using, which are all from the from newspapers rather of the time, I've explored the relationship between these regulations and this reactive perception of threat to masculinity, and particularly this threat to white masculinity that they seemingly pose through what was characterized by particularly resistant right-wing actants to be this apparent feminization of pathologized populations. So this idea that everyone's being feminized, everyone's being controlled in different ways, and submitting to COVID regulations is a form of feminization. So in order to do this, I'm drawing on the work of Andrea Long-Chu, who's a sort of rising star in gender and trans theory, and their 2009 polemic, Females a Concern. And in that book, which has been, I'll get into the response to it, she argues that being female is essentially the universal human condition, as she says, ontologically, as well as biologically, and to some extent socially. And I really love this because I love this idea of someone swinging for the fences with a claim, but I also think that it's actually true. Like, I think that her quite radical claim that everyone is ontologically and biologically and socially female at first rings true, and I'll talk about why. So where being female is defined by self-negation, quote, defined by self-negation, any psychic operation in which the self is sacrificed to make room for the desires of another. So Chu makes this argument to examine the motivations behind human behaviour, including the desire to be recognised as gendered, by identifying the contradiction at the heart of human experience. This contradiction that Chu describes as, quote, being female is the tension between the conscious desire humans have for autonomy, for freedom and liberty as individuals, and to be active drivers of our own lives, and the desire to submit to the will of a group, to community, to feel safe within that community, and losing a sense of one's autonomy and individuality in the process. In other words, the relinquishing of autonomy to the needs of the group is something that all humans are required to do. But the extent to which we are female, or the extent to which we are required to negate our desires for the needs of others, is contingent on how our bodies are externally perceived by way of race, gender, class, ability, and so on. Chu's argument and characterization of being female is central to an understanding of how social experiences of feminization operate. So while Chu's work is more focused on the tension between being female, identity, and self-determination, and the question of social recognition on an interpersonal, aesthetic, and cultural register, I'm interested in how we can use this framework and deploy it to understand the complexity of relations between the individual and a sense of obligation to community, particularly through experiences of socialization. So I use the term feminization to describe instances or actions where the experiences of individuals predicated on how others perceive their bodies dictate their capacity for autonomy in any given space. Feminization, in this sense, is an external force applied to individuals based on the external recognition, reception, and perception of their bodies by others, and accordingly, an individual's obligation to bend to that external force. In other words, people of every gender experience feminization, and everyone hates it. Feminization, or the degree to which one is forced to be female, is not a reflection of an individual's sense of their own gender, but rather how an individual's gender is externally socially perceived, recognized, and disciplined. And while an individual can affect perception through a semiotics of presentation and behavior, ultimately, as Chu writes, you do not get to consent to yourself, a definition of femaleness. In this way, the feminization of men with disabilities, of Black men, and the ways in which white women are less female than women of color can be described. Nevertheless, to some extent, quote, everyone is female and everyone hates it, end quote. And gender is a practice enacted in the begging for recognition by others. So it's worth noting here as well that there is a historical context to the separation of female from women in particular. And Chu writes about this a little bit, not enough for my liking, probably, but that historical context is around American slavery and the designation of Black and Indigenous women's bodies as not being women's bodies, but being female, which meant that they could be used but not recognized as people or human beings, but they could be used for medical research in particular. It's also kind of worth noting that we use the term female for livestock. We use the term female for inanimate objects like computer plugs and etc. But we don't use the term women. So it's easy to separate these terms and kind of entirely supportable to do so. Long Chu's book was published toward the end of 2019, and I got a copy in one of the lockdowns in the first half of 2020, and it's like, oh, prophetic. And this struck me immediately, even though it's intended as a reworking and revisioning of Valerie Solanas' manifesto, which is really interesting because Solanas is obviously kind of a TERF darling, and Long Chu is gay. She's also gay, but she's trans. So the reviews of Long Chu's book are then quite surprising. So they either assume that Chu is kind of joking in a sense. So Chu talks about her commitment to a bit, so her commitment to the joke, but the joke being an ethics and an ethics of irony, pointing out a truth. And it's also read as an attack on trans studies. And Chu has emerged from contemporary trans studies and trans theory, but the previous generation of scholars in her field are really, really angry about her work. And I find that fascinating. And I think this opens up a kind of generational divide in trans studies as well as in gender theory. There is a consistent trend, particularly with a number of scholars, including Halberstam, including Susan Stryker as well. They all wrote a special issue of Trans Studies Quarterly about how much they disliked Long Chu's book, which is interesting because that's obviously a lot of notoriety for, I think she was 27 when this was published. So it's pretty impressive, right? In Butler's recent book, which was published a few weeks ago, and I haven't quite finished reading it, but I'm nearly there. It's really disappointing to see that she spends more time engaging with the work of scholars like Holly Lawford-Smith than she does engaging with Andrea Long Chu, and she substantially misreads Long Chu's argument. So it's a really, really disappointing turn. So I think that it's interesting as well because Chu, while she did once declare trans studies over, which I think pissed off a lot of people, frankly, she also writes in an accessible way. And I think that that has led to her being not taken seriously necessarily. And using that irony and humor should not necessarily discount from the point of a text or the argument of a text. So in this analysis, though, I'm not so much interested in using this as a way to define a certain new type of masculinity, toxic masculinity, or emergent masculinity, as I am interested in considering in what this emergent set of public and performative acts of like masculinist resistance means. So namely, it resists this suggestion or potential for experience of being female. It is an explicit resistance of femaleness. So I'm not interested in defining this as like masculinity, as I say, but rather in thinking about what is being resisted in these expressions of violence. Okay, there's another one. So this association between masculinist endeavours and resistance to public health regulations associated with attempts to control and curb the spread of COVID has been exhaustively established. There's so much literature on this phenomenon. It has been noted that suspicion, as well as what's termed masculinist selfishness, extends beyond the responses of the general population to world leaders of Western countries, particularly but not exclusively Bolsonaro, Trump, Johnson, and Putin, who were all obviously world leaders at the time, each of which refused to wear masks at various times. Suspicion around the reported severity and the aggressive continuation of physical contact was common with others, is used, and this is used as a marker of what such leaders perceive to be masculinist vitality. A performance designed to be understood as reassuring absolute certainty through aggressive insistence that the threat of uncertainty does not exist. Quote, simply put, during this global pandemic, investment in masculinity as fearlessness and in control facilitates the spread of the disease, end quote. So this selfishness implies a lack of empathy and willingness to sacrifice the vulnerable, and obviously refusing to admit potential vulnerability as well, or to recognize it at all, while perhaps more importantly, refusing an obligation to a broader community and by extension to the social contract that underpins it. The association between adherence to the social contract, the perception and fear of feminization is tangibly articulated through this refusal. Tangibly, rather, yeah. Chu explains that gender, then, is a response to being female and that our capacities to respond to being female are dictated by our physical and social realities. So you can be female, but if you have a body socially understood to be biologically male, you have a different set of circumstances by which you might respond to being female. You might then understand yourself to be a man, to be non-binary, to be a woman, but ultimately that understanding stems from your response to being female, regardless. Everyone then develops gender and a sense of gendered identity because everyone is subject to some form of feminization. This is what is asked of people, although obviously to different extents and in different ways in interaction with other people, in communities and in society at large in general. The positionality of femaleness is justified in calling this experience female, regardless of the gender of the people experiencing it, because, as Chu says, quote, everybody already does. To be female is to be an object of someone else's desire, and most importantly here, subject to the whims of another, community or body. The phenomenon of gender convincingly as being how people respond or react to their specific experience of being female using physical and social resources available to them. She removes the position of being female from the tether of womanhood by acknowledging that while being female has a biological basis, from a biological standpoint, as I said earlier, everyone is already originally and potentially female. What happens to a person's body after that produces their relationship to their ontological point of origin, their relationship to being female, and therefore their gendered position. In this case, it emerges that the COVID-19 pandemic has reminded men, specifically white men, of their being female in Chu's terms, and the performance of refusal to comply with public health orders, culminating eventually in violence, is one such defense mechanism. The enforcement of femaleness or feminization is a process by which bodies perceived by others to be female, as well as bodies that understand themselves to be female, just remembered time, learn to negotiate the world. This is an experiential and ongoing process that is configured differently for each person and is inflected by different kinds of experiences dependent on whether or not the individual is trans or cisgendered, whether they're a person of color, white, belong to a specific racial group or social class, religion, whether they're Indigenous, or how and whether they're disabled. Feminization is a tool of control applied unevenly and inequitably across racial and other divides. Consider again the femininity required of Black women as compared to white women, as compared to Asian or Indigenous women. Each of these and many others have distinctions in how femaleness is judged, corrected, and coded. Power and privilege trace complex lines across these boundaries, exerting divides in predictable and at the same time unexpected places. Is that going to work? Yes. This practice of feminization is crucially, inextricably bound to colonial power, which in turn forms our relationships communally and individually to the social contract. As Wiradjuri scholar Sandy O'Sullivan notes, the rigid binarization of gender is a colonial project, and one designed to trace the lineage of whiteness to the exclusion of the racialized, indigenized other. This practice reproduces whiteness through the classification and disciplining of gender normative behaviors, experiences, and morphologies, necessarily pathologizing and limiting gender diversity in First Nations cultures in settler colonial contexts. Kim Tallbear also talks about this as well, but from a Canadian perspective. And both O'Sullivan and Tallbear have noted that there's all these kinds of practices relating to gender reproduced through sexual monogamy, compulsory heterosexuality, and rigid gender roles, including the practice of feminization of certain bodies. These are all colonial practices used to reproduce whiteness, crucially, quote, linked to concepts of property. In other words, feminization is a key practice of colonization, the making property and the taking as property of other people, other bodies, justified by their modulated difference to the colonial holotype of straight white cis masculinity. This is the Westgate Bridge, if anyone's familiar with that. That was the time that they were all just allowed to dance around on there and no one stopped them. I'm going to talk about this a little bit later, but compare this to how the police respond to queer people at Midsummer when they protest. Compare this to how the police respond to protesters, you know, who are trying to stop arms going to Israel, versus how the police are responding to white men on across the Westgate. You can go directly to jail, and someone did recently for 30 days for being on the Westgate and having a protest. None of these men went to jail. Very interesting. Next. Okay. One's body, socially constituted as a pathology, is an experience of being female characteristic of the experience of living during the COVID-19 pandemic. The set of everyday restrictions imposed upon everyone closely resembled those that regulate and discipline women's bodies more generally. While this is not inherently feminine to be controlled, oppressed, reduced, but rather a reflection of the patriarchal social control of femininity that constitutes women as Chu says, the select delegates of being female, and therefore the experience of feminization accordingly. So this can be understood as a set of lessons transfigured into a set of behaviors designed to train people to train rather the individual person towards normative, if not stereotypical, feminine behavior. This can include common examples like self-protection messages, routinely communicated to women about their movements and behavior in public spaces, like don't be out at night, don't be drunk, wear modest clothing, stay away from people, as well as culturally specific standard practices about how women should appear and behave. These rules are explicitly explicitly restrict and prohibit and make transgressive behavior by women perceived to be socially inappropriate. And those behaviors are typically, although not always, far more socially acceptable for those people perceived to be or who perceive themselves to be men. Feminization is, broadly speaking, a tactic of limitation and control. The prohibition of being female binds all kinds of bodies beholden to those limitations that offer relational freedom to those who most easily escape the clutches of feminization, i.e. cis white men. Key to most characteristics or sets of appropriate behaviors associated with feminization is the expectation of the reduction of the body in public space, framing female bodies as otherwise at risk. And so we see this in COVID. All bodies are suddenly at risk and at risk of transmitting pathology as well. So that Iris Marion Young concept of throwing like a girl and taking up space becomes something that is applied to the whole population. The notion of taking up physical space becomes complicated under COVID by practices like social and spatial distancing. Speaking up is complicated by the visual and physical barrier of masks, and the virulent disease itself is a challenge to a body's robust health. Perhaps most importantly, the best way to control the spread of disease and serious illness from it, vaccination, is provided through a series of intramuscular injections, breaching the physical and psychic barrier of the skin. The mediatized global and spatial controls that have governed populations under COVID have given all people a palpable sense of this feminization of being female. And so this has meant that the pandemic has revealed a hatred of being female, as it has laid bare a range of interventions that most men are not regularly accustomed to being subject to. So this kind of physical distancing, this kind of idea of curfews, surveillance, limits, activity specifications and definitions are entirely new, particularly to white men, particularly to cis white men who haven't had to think about how their bodies are in public spaces. So the level of policing and population level surveillance, while deeply disturbing, was least accepted by that portion of the population of cis white men in particular, who chose to riot against them. Refer to the previous one on that slide. So women, people perceived to be so, and people subject to feminization are long familiar with this pathologization of their bodies. And there's this kind of sense that their bodies are, easily breached. Everything about them is diseased, and to be feminized then is at least in part to learn that one's body is a liability, open to invasion and exploitation if not policed by these systems. So women and people who are feminized in different ways and to different extents learn that they are reliant upon community for safety, and so must adhere to these rules for that safety. And so when we have a situation where the entire population is asked to adhere to those same rules, people who perceive themselves to not require that safety resist. So the terms of the COVID-19 pandemic have forced populations ordinarily inoculated by that privilege to consider the vulnerability of embodiment in this unprecedented way. So at the time, there were a lot of discussions around parallels between like Susan Sontag's observations of the language of infection as politicized with the AIDS crisis. The COVID virus has made that politicization quite different. And from this, a culture emerged where hegemonic masculinity is performed through a refusal to wear protective equipment, to take protective measures, to avoid infection, to refuse vaccination, and to obviously riot against lockdowns. And this phenomenon reflects a desire to refuse even the suggestion of having a permeable or vulnerable body or relying on any kind of safety from community. Which brings me to the social contract. So the social contract and the idea of work related to it. I'm actually really interested in how many people were protesting to go back to work, particularly because there were so many like supports to allow people to stay home and still get paid, and yet. But that aside, that's a separate project and just a question in my mind. But the social contract, the principle that individuals forego some freedoms rather for the protection of social cohesion and fulfillment of community, is, after Rousseau, a well-established tenet of modernity. The interpretation of the social contract varies widely, but generally speaking, insists that in order to live in a community, the individual has an obligation to that community. Where Rousseau imagined the obligation as one of equals, albeit within a very limited framework of who gets to choose in the first place, This framework of obligation to the other, broadly speaking, and to those around us in particular, is one far more familiar to people who have experienced greater feminization by virtue of their gendered appearance, race, sex body, or sexuality. It's been observed that the effective promotion of COVID-19 management, as well as vaccination updates, should feature an appeal and even a reinvigoration of the social contract. So that's sort of something that's been discussed in these campaigns. And this idea that the common interest is served by submission to vaccination. So the idea that vaccination and the individual, after Rousseau, must submit to that far greater common interest is kind of lost if a citizen refuses to adhere to that social contract, which, as Rousseau writes, he should then be forced to be free. The implication being that without citizenship, the subject can no longer expect the comfort and protection of the society that requires that contract. Many anti-lockdown protesters may agree to this freedom, primarily because they lack an understanding about what it means to live without the protection of social order, as a result of the social cushioning that white masculinity provides. As Charles Mills argued, this social cushioning is predicated on a racial contract that relies on the exclusion of non-white people and their objectification in relation to the Western humanist white male subject. Similarly, women and feminized bodies are socially constructed as a reproductive resource, historically without full access to citizenship or suffrage, meaning that they are subject to the social laws and prohibitions, but are historically limited in their capacity to change them. While access to the protections associated with the social contract are predicated on their racialization, where white women are afforded greater social protection than women of color. In other words, in one way or another, we're all socially obligated to the social contract to bend. We all bend differently and to different extents in different circumstances, but everyone has a sense of making way in common, whether they acknowledge it or not. So this requirement to bend, what can then be understood as being female or putting the needs and desires of someone else ahead of our own, gives us the potential to see community, the capacity to appreciate an experience that is not our own and to empathize. So those most infrequently subject to that experience, particularly during the COVID-19 pandemic, rage as a result from the sense of obligation, which has been demonstrated for the first time. So being female as a social obligation is then asked of white men least often of all. So reminiscent of Olympe de Gouges' statement in the Declaration of the Rights of Woman, 1791, that, quote, "A woman has the right to mount the scaffold. She must equally have the right to mount the rostrum," which, as I've discussed elsewhere, establishes a relationship between marginalised bodies that are subject to the laws of the state but are excluded in participating in their establishment. So this description is reliant as well on Nash's characterisation of Patricia Hill Collins's matrix of domination that, quote, "sought to attend to structures of power rather than identity and subjectivity," end quote, and how it allows for the recognition of difference as well as likeness, quote, "the violence that structures of domination inflict in various ways and in differing severity on everyone," end quote. So this brings me to the idea of police restraint. So a striking characteristic of the policing of both the Melbourne anti-lockdown protests, as well as other protests that were happening around the world that were predominantly populated by cis white men, numerous reports and recordings showed police being assaulted by the participants of those riots, and the police showing a lack of aggression, a lack of response when compared to the far more aggressive responses to the comparatively law-abiding protests of things like the Black Lives Matter movement that were occurring simultaneously in the US, the UK and Australia, as well as the queer protests more recently, as well as the pro-Palestinian rallies more recently, suggest a tacit support, if not complicity, in policing. Again, the police force in both instances, characterised by whiteness and colonial institutions, judge the aggression of white men differently and punish it less severely than that of other kinds of people. So again, people are unequally required to submit The result being that rioters who aim clearly to, in some senses to destroy property, to attack people, to enact violence across streets are not necessarily brought to justice, and there's nothing, further that happens to them, including things like what happened on the Westgate Bridge. So more than the crowd simply being constituted primarily by white men, the lockdown protests were characterised by members of the crowd sporting far-right, white supremacist and other extremist symbols. So amongst the images that I've shown you today, there are a number of white supremacist symbols. There's also, I was looking at the images just before, and I spotted one I hadn't noticed before, which was like a COVID conspiracy t-shirt of like Bill Gates, and like it was like Kill Bill, i.e. Bill Gates, because they thought that Bill Gates was like propagating COVID somehow. There were also models of gallows documented, and then there were a lot of people marching alongside or with Nazi symbols, implying their support. And we can see through this that this idea of feminization is inherently racialized as well as gendered, as only white men are able, for the most part, to entirely avoid being female in nearly, but as we've seen through COVID, not all circumstances. And so they are the most outraged when they perceive an imposition on their individual autonomy. These examples reflect a broader inability for those whose masculinity is most fragile to cope with the health advice given and restrictions imposed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. The rage of cis white men in response to the imposition of community, of being female, is one supported by colonialism, which promises white men in particular that their desires should never be compromised by the will of anyone or anything else. And everyone hates it. Thanks.
Okay, thanks so much, Erin. That was fascinating and utterly lucid. I'm looking forward to hearing people's questions and comments. So would anyone like to start off with a comment or a question?
Thanks, Erin. Gee, it's really exciting work. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today. And I have learnt a lot through this process, which is really wonderful. I've got lots of questions and I don't know if any of them will make sense. So let's see if we can get to. A few things. I mean, I really want to know, I haven't read Butler's new book, so I'm really interested in what her analysis is that you're contesting, but we'll come back to that. But I think, first of all, I had a question around work and that depiction of work, and you've mentioned that that's something that you are thinking about elsewhere. But I mean, I think that's, it seems to be a really rich vein to pursue in terms of the types of work that were, that are being encapsulated in that notion of everyone has a right to work and how we conceive of work in terms of feminisation more broadly. So just any sort of thoughts on that. And I was then also interested in this idea of other groups that might, and I know this is outside of the COVID pandemic, and this might be where it gets a little bit weird, right? If we're thinking about people, I'm thinking in particular of mothers or parents, particularly mothers who refuse vaccination for children because of, whatever, often they're identified as being stereotypical hippies or something like that, making a rejection. And the correlation of the sort of same sort of analysis, like does that work in are they also, I mean, they're refusing the social contract, are they also entitled, what is their sort of sense of entitlement? So
okay, I'll do the second one first,
cool.
if that's okay. So in terms of the idea of like the new age hippie refusal of COVID vaccinations in particular, I think at the time it was a little more confusing than it is now. Now the new age to white supremacy pipeline is like a well-trodden path. But a few years ago, we were less aware of that. But it is overwhelmingly like white women in particular who are like refusing vaccinations for their children or themselves. And again, it's this sense of like autonomy and this like right to choose in opposition to the community or the rights of the community in such a way that suggests that you feel less vulnerable than perhaps you should, right? So that obligation to community and that sense of safety that community provides is something felt a lot more strongly by people who are more often subjected to violence or feel the threat of violence, and so behave accordingly. The other thing that I would say around that was that at the time that this was happening, I was starting some research. I sort of like submitted a few like grant applications and everybody ignored me. I was like, fine. I was like, but around like doing research in the distinction between anti-vaxxer rhetoric and vaccine hesitancy. So there was a strong vein of like particularly communities of color who were like refusing vaccinations for extremely different reasons. And that's a really different conversation. And it's usually around the fact that things like vaccination programs have been used to surveil communities like in Iran, for example. And so they have vaccine hesitancy. It's not about refusing on the basis of individual autonomy. It's about refusing on the basis of refusing state surveillance. Different kettle of fish entirely. So yeah. But yeah, no one cared. So that was rude. Anyway.
Don't give up, Erin. Keep trying.
I mean, a bit late now till the next pandemic. We'll wait then. But next year after, too much, the animal trade, etc. blah, blah, blah. In terms of work, I think it's really interesting because like the protests are using the aesthetics of the union movement, right? And so the union movement's about limiting the exploitation of workers, you know, by those who own the means of production, just to be Marxist for 5 minutes, and like insisting that you should be allowed to work when government supports are allowing you not to work, suggests to me a like fundamental like lack of understanding of that relationship and like union movement purposes in general, and like the broader relationship of like the exploitation of workers by like the owners. At the same time, I think it also feeds into a sense of like what we understand to be Australian masculinity in particular. So we have this like fetishized view of like white masculinity in Australia as being working class, which is almost entirely not the case, of being like outdoor laborers, of like VB ads, essentially is what we're talking about from the 80s. I use them to teach Australian masculinity all the time. This is perfect case study. And so we have this like image, this like ideal image, and part of that is physical labor. So if you're asked to stay home for 2 weeks, then who are you? And I think that's a large part of that as well. And I think that's why you see a lot of those like, we're to be allowed to work.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah,
and if they've got any caring responsibilities, it's much easier to be out at work.
Exactly. Yeah. Oh yeah, because then you have to look after the kids. Yeah, obviously. Yeah. Like
Hi, Erin. Thank you. Yeah, that was a really interesting, stimulating, great talk. Thank you very much. I'm sort of left reflecting a little bit on your sort of excursus into sort of social contract theory here. And you know, your read of kind of your read through Long Chu, you know, of the feminization kind of process, and this being a kind of response to a kind of, you know, perception of feminization, and that kind of line that, you know, everyone's female and everyone hates it, you know, and it sort of just strikes me that, you know, that's very much kind of in a way flips the kind of analysis of, you know, I guess kind of Carol Pateman, you know, where it was like the social contract was the sexual contract, right?
Yeah.
Or Charles Mills, it's a racial contract. That is that the social contract actually embodies and protects masculine racialized privilege.
Yeah.
So to sort of then sort of flip it and say, well, actually, this is a process of feminization that people are subject to.
Yeah.
You know, then, and it kind of got me sort of thinking about the sort of you know, the different ends of kind of protest here. On the one hand, a kind of, you know, a kind of left kind of critique of contract theory, and then that other tradition of kind of the outlaw hero that can't be kind of subject to, you know, their liberty being curtailed in any sense. So I'm sort of just sort of wondering about how we make sense of that kind of doubling in a way.
Yeah, and it's kind of tricky because it's like whenever I'm doing anything, I find myself at this like resistant paradox. I don't know why. I just always end up there. It's who I am. Here we are. But I think it's interesting because, yeah, you're exactly right. Like on the one hand, we have social contract is designed to protect dominant order of society. On the other hand, it also inoculates us from absolute freedom, right? And so it means that we have an obligation to the other. So I think it's also about the distinction between a sense of community which is cultivated through feminization. So like the being female, being forced to be female means that you constantly think of what others are doing, how you're obligated to them, right? Whereas if you're not constantly presented with that to the same extent or in different ways, you're not constantly thinking of that like informal practice of community and that sort of interpersonal as well as like broader community obligation. And so I think there's something in there between the formal and the informal community that's the social contract kind of passes between. And I think that the social contract is like obviously sort of uses bodies like racialized bodies and gendered bodies as a resource to reproduce itself, but it also passes into the informal contract of like responsibility to the other and like heaven forbid Levinasian responsibility to the other, but we won't go there. Yeah, and I think it's an interesting paradox that I want to kind of tease out more, you know, if I ever had time and brain space, but yeah, don't know if that answers that. Sure.
It's a think space, isn't it?
Yeah,
So,
totally.
one
Yeah.
can. But yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that's okay.
So I was wondering the root of the word sort of female and talking about feminization, how does that go with feminist and the feminist movement? Because that was all about fighting for equality and changing that definition of what it meant to be female. And does it almost undermine the feminist movement in saying that to be female, you're, you know, following rules and you're not going against anything that is someone else's desire and so on and so forth? Does that almost undermine what it means to be female in a feminist lens?
Well, I think, okay, so first of all, female always meant that long before feminist was invented, right? And so we can split female from femininity and feminist, but also feminism is about the rights of women, not the rights of females, because it's not about the rights of like a female plug or, you know, a female animal necessarily, right? Animal rights is a separate, although related field, right? So I don't think it undermines it in any way. I think that there is an issue with a misunderstanding, and like one of the most common misreadings of Chu's work is like oh, well, like Chu just means like we've, you know, we don't want women to just be this. And like Chu is very clear that like women are select delegates of femaleness. They're forced to be female more, but they are not female. And sometimes women hate being female the most because we're like most often sort of, you know, have it applied to us in a sense. And so, yeah, and there's even a section at the start of her book where she sort of talks about how like feminists are the least female because they're like trying to have rights. And so like that's inherently unfemale of them. And so it's one of those things in that book, and I think it's really smart and I think it's really compelling to like force you to constantly challenge your association with words and the relationship between words. But I think it's a really, I say it's compelling because I think it's the right kind of way of rethinking that association. Yeah, thanks.
I haven't thought this question out
Okay.
at all. It's very half-baked. But I was just kind of thinking, I love Chu's work, by the way, and I loved your marriage of Chu's ideas on femaleness and our response to the pandemic and suddenly feeling or being aware of our vulnerability. That all feels very right to me. But I was thinking too about the way that at once we were both vulnerable bodies, but we were also suddenly threats to each other.
Yeah.
We were kind of, we were victims, and we were also like potential murderers all the time.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if there was also this sort of simultaneous masculinization that happened to us, and that maps less nicely with Chu's work, maybe. But I just wondered, sort of what you thought about that and how you would map Chu's work onto it. There you go. That's my half thing.
No, that's okay. No, I sort of thought about that as well, but I think of it like, you know how Foucault, I think it's Foucault, talks about like this idea of like women's bodies, and well, Foucault doesn't talk about women's bodies often, but he does talk about like sexuality and women's bodies in sexuality. And it's like women have a responsibility to curtail the sexuality of others precisely because they're a threat as well. So, and that comes from like a Catholic dogma of like women's sexuality as threat. And so obviously like Foucault's pulling apart Catholic dogma and going, hey, it's the new psychiatry is the new Catholicism. It's the whole thing. But yeah, so thinking about how women's bodies and women's sexuality is a threat is also a sense by which women have to curtail themselves. They're obligated to control that because the threat is that they'll disrupt relationships between men. And that's something that like Irigere talks about in her early work as well, as this like women's bodies as being like an exchange object between men, and then also an object of value in like culture as, you know, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so I think in terms of COVID, when we conceive of ourselves as threat, we conceive of ourselves as threat and the obligation to remove that threat from others in much the same way as that, like that idea of being appropriately female or the idea of acting appropriately as a woman under like, you know, Judeo-Christianity is to remove the threat of yourself, the pathology of yourself, the excessive sexuality of yourself from the, you know, exchange between people in order to be appropriately behaved. And I think that's where that lies in the being female, is knowing that that's an obligation. Whereas like the men in the protest were like, we don't care if we kill people, right? Whereas like women are taught that they should care greatly. And so feel that obligation to remove themselves. So yeah, that's what I would, yeah.
No, I think that was a very brilliant answer to the question. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you. And this is just a brief comment, really. I was wondering why it was feminization rather than, I don't know whether it's a word, infantilization of the population. But then when you said it was entailed the care and concern for others, that made it different again.
Yeah.
So there was a strong element of infantilization of the population, which I think a lot of men did react against.
Yeah.
But there's the care and concern, that endemic care and concern, just elevated and changed that. So thank you. That was really thought-provoking.
Yeah, because it's like the hollowing out of yourself for the needs of someone else. And
which you don't have as an infant.
That's right. Absolutely the opposite, right? And like, yeah, and that's what Chu describes as like the inherent being femaleness, is the hollowing out of oneself for the needs of another and the desires of another.
I learned a lot. I'm just a little bit confused about the word feminization, in the sense that in my mind, I'm trying to differentiate it between, and trying to explicitly differentiate it between oppression or control. And then my mind goes on to men and women in Gaza, right? And the reaction, they're clearly being oppressed and clearly being controlled. But is the feminization about trying to control someone who doesn't normally get controlled? Is that what you mean by feminization? Is that the differentiation?
So feminization is the enforcement of like the hollowing out of oneself to the needs of another. So where Andrea Longchu says being female, I say feminization. So feminization is a word that we haven't really used in feminist and gender studies since like the 80s, frankly, which I find really interesting because I'm really interested in the way that gender is enacted on other people's bodies. So we have a lot of discussion these days around how our gender identity is really something that we say for ourselves. And so as a result, when we talk about gender, it's always like something that, you know, we're allowed to say how we feel. We say that we're this gender, and like there's a really important conversation around that, but also other people impose it upon us all the time. And gender is really formed in the relationship between what we feel and what other people feel. So when Chu says like being female, or I say like being female, but also feminization of populations, I'm saying that that kind of position, that subject position or non-subject position, is being imposed upon people. So it's the imposition of that lack of self, essentially, or individual sense of self, which is a form of control and it's a form of oppression. So it's both. Yeah.
Okay, cheers.
Yeah, it's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. I found that totally fascinating and you know, quite riveting to listen to too. my attention was struck by the protester who had mandate on his sign, and he had man-date.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering about the connection between feminisation, as you've theorised it, and homophobia.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously there is a lot of the majority of the people who were protesting were obviously performing a very heteronormative masculinist sort of way of being. There certainly wasn't a great deal of queerness or gayness within the crowd. I do wonder what the rest of that sign says. I was just looking at that today and being like, I wonder what that says. Did it say orgasm? I couldn't find the word orgasm.
Just to repeat that for the at-home audience, the sign said the only mandate we need ends with an orgasm.
Yeah, because you can't see who's holding it.
Queer sign.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But yeah, and because there's so few women in the crowd, but there are a few, there's 3 or 4 in the entire image, which is also indicative. But yeah, and I find that really interesting, because obviously the masculinity as performed in those protests is very much threatened by homosexuality in any and
But
all
at the
forms
same
of
time, they're having a massive mandate.
at the same time. Well, that is typical of fragile and toxic and super right-wing masculinity, is the exclusion of women, is the exclusion of gender diversity, is the exclusion of queerness, to reproduce, because it's fragile against all those things, and yet is deeply homosocial. So yeah, that's par for the course, but yes, also quite indicative. Yeah,
thank you. Okay, looks like it's about time to finish up. Please join me again in thanking Erin for a really fabulous presentation.
everyone.